Every morning started the same. I would leave the house where the cold autumn wind had already touched the leaves on the trees and head to the small, cozy cafe around the corner. It had become a habit. But it wasn't just the smell of fresh coffee that drew me here. The secret lay in Barbara, the barista with a bright smile and friendly eyes, who began each day for me with a few words that energized me for the whole day. Her voice was so gentle that even the noise of the coffee machine couldn't drown it out. Every time I stood at the counter, she looked at me with an attention as if we were old friends. But each time, our conversations grew deeper, as if there was something more in the air than just formal greetings. That day, everything was as usual. I entered the cafe, and before I even took a step, her eyes met mine. Her smile was as warm as ever, but there was a new note in it, something elusive. I ordered my usual latte, and Barbara began to prepare it with the same ease and grace I'd always noticed. She sprinkled a bit of ground cinnamon into my cup, as if it were a special sign between us. "How was your evening?" she asked, her gaze fixed on me while she frothed the milk. "Not bad," I smiled back. "And yours?" Her answer was unexpected. Barbara shared that after work she had taken a long walk around the city, enjoying the cool evening air. There was a slight melancholy in her voice, which was unusual for her. I felt strange, as if that melancholy infected me too. When she handed me my coffee, our hands touched for a brief moment. It was just a second, but it was enough to feel something changing inside me. For the first time in a long while, I couldn't look away from her face. "See you tomorrow," she said, her voice soft and deep, almost a whisper. I nodded and left the cafe, holding the hot cup. The chill of the street quickly brought me back to reality, but thoughts of Barbara lingered. I thought about how our conversations had stopped being merely friendly. Something more was forming between us, intangible yet palpable, and I didn't know what to do with it. This day seemed like the beginning of something new. I sensed that there was more ahead of us, though I didn't yet realize how deeply we were already in it. A few days passed after that morning conversation with Barbara, but its echoes still resonated in my head. Her voice, her gaze, everything left a strange feeling of something unsaid. I tried to focus on work, but my thoughts kept drifting back to that fleeting meeting in the cafe. One day, during an unusually long lunch break, I decided to walk in the park near the office. I needed fresh air, hoping it would help me clear my mind. As I entered the park, the sun was setting, casting a golden light over the trees. I walked along a quiet path when I suddenly saw her. Barbara was sitting on a bench, alone, as if waiting for someone, lost in thought. Seeing her here, outside the familiar cafe, I slowed my steps. A coincidence? Or something more? "Adam?" Her voice sounded genuinely surprised to see me. She smiled, but there was a slight worry in her eyes. "Hi, Barbara," I approached, feeling a light flutter inside. "How did you end up here?" "I sometimes come here after my shift," she shrugged. "This place helps me relax a bit." I sat next to her, sensing a silence between us. But it wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was more like a quiet anticipation of something new. "I've been thinking a lot about our conversation," I began, not looking at her but staring at the slowly swirling leaves on the ground. "About how you said I was different from other customers." Barbara sighed slightly and turned to me. That same sparkle I noticed in the cafe appeared in her eyes again. "And you? What do you think about it?" she asked quietly. My heart beat faster. I knew this was a moment when something important was supposed to happen. Words didn't matter as much as before. What mattered was not what we said, but what we felt. I turned to her, and our eyes met. In that moment, everything between us, hints, accidental touches, suddenly made sense. Unexpectedly, Barbara leaned towards me, and I couldn't resist. Her lips gently touched mine, and in that instant, time seemed to stand still. It wasn't just a kiss. It was an answer to all those questions we couldn't ask each other in words. In that kiss, there was something familiar, yet completely new. It contained our unspeakable connection, which now became obvious. When we parted, I looked at her, and she smiled, but now with a slight hint of confidence, as if this kiss had resolved all her doubts. "I think I've been thinking about this a lot too," quietly said, feeling the air between us grow warmer, as if the sunlight had intensified. Our paths seemed inextricably connected, and at that moment I realized that this kiss was only the beginning of something much bigger. A few days passed after that kiss in the park. Life seemed to go on as usual. I would get up, go to work, just like always. But something had changed. A quiet anticipation settled within me. Each time I approached the cafe, my heart beat a bit faster, as if expecting something more. Barbara always greeted me with her usual smile, but there was something new in her eyes, something we both understood, though we didn't speak about it. One morning, I found myself at the counter watching her prepare my latte. Everything seemed routine, but I knew that behind her calm gestures, something far more complex was hidden. We talked about trivial things, about the weather, the news, the gradual shift from cold days to winter winds, but with each word, I felt our silence grow louder. "Shall we meet later?" I asked suddenly, surprising even myself with the question. Barbara looked up at me. Her eyes widened slightly, but then a soft smile played on her face. She nodded, and I knew this evening would be different from any before. After work, I headed back to the park. Now this place reminded me of Barbara, of those moments that were changing everything. The wind rustled the trees, filling the air with the sound of autumn leaves. She sat on the bench, as if waiting for me, just like last time. I joined her, and this time our silence felt charged, full of quiet but undeniable energy. "Have you been thinking about this all along?" she asked, her voice gentle, almost like a caress to the soul. I couldn't lie. The time between our last kiss and tonight had been filled with thoughts of her. I nodded, knowing that my admission held meaning for both of us. "So have I," she answered softly. A moment of silence hung between us, but then she leaned closer, her breath barely touching my skin. This time the kiss wasn't as hesitant or quick as before. It was deeper, filled with certainty, as if we'd finally dared to open a door to a part of our emotions we'd never considered before. When our lips parted, I felt it was more than just physical closeness. It was a moment of understanding, where there were no longer any doubts. We looked at each other, and in those gazes, there were no unspoken words left. "I don't think we can pretend it's just friendship anymore." I finally broke the silence, and Barbara nodded, her eyes glowing with understanding. Silence enveloped us once more, but this time it was different. A silence filled with a new reality, where we both acknowledged that our feelings could no longer stay hidden. The next morning, I felt slightly out of place. It seemed that after that meeting in the park, something in my life had shifted. The world around remained the same streets, the same faces, but inside changes were happening that were hard to explain. I returned to the cafe, moving as if by inertia, but I already knew. A simple morning coffee would never be the same. Barbara greeted me at the counter with her usual smile, but her eyes revealed everything. There were no more boundaries between us. We'd moved past moments of doubt, cautious touches, and our first kiss. Now, with those invisible boundaries erased, everything felt more open, but also more daunting. "The usual?" she asked, but there was a subtle playfulness in her voice. "Of course," I replied, trying not to show that it was the only question she could ask that didn't carry tension. We both knew the game of small talk was over. After those moments in the park, we both wanted more, though what more meant was still unknown. Her hands trembled slightly as she handed me my latte, and our fingers brushed again briefly. "I want to see you tonight," I said suddenly, realizing I couldn't wait any longer. We could no longer hide behind familiar rituals. She looked at me intently, her expression serious once more. "Yes," she whispered with quiet but steady confidence. "I want that too." That evening, I arrived at the park where we usually met. Leaves fell quietly to the ground, and the cool wind played with the branches of the trees. I was the first to arrive, and the waiting made me nervous. Everything that had happened between us until now had felt like a dream. But now, standing on the brink of something more real, was I ready? Barbara appeared so quietly I didn't notice her at first. She walked closer, and we stood there silently, knowing that words were unnecessary. We walked deeper into the park, toward that same bench where it had all begun. The atmosphere between us grew thick and intense, not tense, but filled with anticipation. "I've been thinking about this a lot," she said quietly as we stopped. "About us." I nodded, feeling that her thoughts mirrored mine. "It's been haunting me too," I replied, moving closer. "But something tells me it's right." She didn't respond immediately, she just looked at me, and I saw so many emotions in her gaze that words were no longer needed. I leaned closer, and our lips met once more in a quiet but meaningful kiss that was both a promise and the beginning of something bigger. As evening turned to dusk, I walked down that familiar path in the park, where so much had changed for Barbara and me. Today, everything felt different. The air was colder, leaves crunched beneath my feet, moving in a rhythm that matched my thoughts. The past few days had felt like a fog, dense with emotions, expectations, and things that no longer fit into ordinary life. We both knew that tonight's meeting would be different. There were no mysteries left, no unspoken feelings, no hesitant touches. Everything had come to light when we let our emotions take over. Now, we had to understand what this meant for us. I arrived before her. Standing by the same bench, watching the quiet sunset, I tried to find answers to the questions that had been tormenting me. But no answers came, only a feeling that everything was leading to an inevitable conclusion. Barbara arrived so quietly that I didn't notice her at first. Her steps were soft but determined. When she drew closer, I saw the same understanding in her eyes. We could no longer turn back. Everything that had happened had changed us forever. "Have you thought about it?" she asked, sitting down on the bench beside me. "All the time," I replied honestly, not looking away. "But I still don't know where it's leading us." Barbara nodded, her eyes dropping briefly as if she was also searching for something in those words. "I'm afraid that if we go through with this, everything will change." Her voice was quiet, but I sensed its strength. "It already has," I whispered, realizing I could no longer hide the truth. "We both know it." We found ourselves once again on the edge of something significant. This moment was full of silence, but within it brewed emotions like a quiet storm ready to burst. Slowly, I took her hand, feeling her warmth, her strength. "I don't want us to hold back," I said, looking straight into her eyes. "If we take this step, it won't just be a departure from the ordinary, it'll be a new path." Barbara remained silent, but her fingers tightened around my hand. We both understood that this moment was the final step, a step into something greater than simple feelings. It was a step into a future where we would have to make choices that would change us forever. Finally, she spoke. "Then let's take it together." Those words held everything. We both stood up, holding hands, and walked slowly through the park toward the unknown, but without fear. Together, we took that step, knowing that now nothing would hold us back. This was the beginning of something new, and we were ready.